This is the famous call of Moses, the story of the Exodus, and the beginning of God's revealing God's name to Moses and revealing God's plan for his life to Moses. And so all kinds of revealing going on here through this burning bush. And so the burning bush has become so popular for us today that we can say whether we've had a burning bush moment or not when we reference having a revelation from God, or wow, God has really spoken to me, and it was in this burning bush moment where it was just so in your face that you knew something was happening. And so that's where we are with the story of Moses. I encourage you to go back and pick up the first couple chapters of Exodus to get a real sense of understanding of where Moses was coming from and where Moses came from before you jump too far into the future of where Moses is going and where God is leading him. But just basic reminder for all of us, whether you've heard this story before or whether this is the first time, basically what has happened is the people of God are in Egypt, and things were going pretty well for them as long as the Pharaoh, the guy in charge, remembered the story of Joseph. Remember how Joseph was the one that saved the Egyptians. And so as long as the person at the top knew who Joseph was and remembered his story, everything was cool. But what has happened now in their history is that a new Pharaoh has come to reign. He doesn't know Joseph. He starts to worry about how strong and how popular in terms of the amount of people the Israelites have come to in their history. And so he starts to oppress them, put them into terrible conditions of work and slavery. And now it's out even to the point where they're starting to kill off the Hebrew boys, the sons. Moses is saved through all that by his mother putting him in a basket, putting him in the river. One of the pharaohs, or one of the Egyptians, find him in the water, and he's saved out of that. You can read that story for yourself. And so he has a miraculous beginning. Now he's an adult. God's come to him in the bush, the burning bush, and he has a job for him. Moses doesn't think he's equipped for this job, and so we have this back and forth, which is pretty common in the biblical stories. God calls an ordinary, flawed human being like Moses, like Ronnie, like Wendy, like me. Nobody's spectacular in terms of, we're not talking about superheroes, we're talking about normal people like us. God calls them, they say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not a superhero, why are you calling me? And then they have this back and forth, and eventually God says, hey, I wouldn't be calling you if I wasn't going to equip you. And so this is the story of Moses. Moses, having God reveal himself to him, calling him, giving him some assurance of I'm going to be with you as we go forward on this plan to save the Israelites from the Pharaoh, and you're going to be the leader that I'm going to use. And so that's the story of Moses in 30 seconds. My version of 30 seconds. 5 minutes, right? Every couple years, it's important, I think, for us to, us meaning Pastor Melissa and I, to remember our calls. And one of the best ways to remember our calls from God is to share it with you. And so I'm not sure if you heard my call story the last time around, or whether I was on the other circuit, or whatever it was. But I'm going to share a portion of my story with you. And maybe you've heard some of this story, but certainly there's new people here that have not. And so hopefully my story, which is an important exercise for me, but more importantly in the context of this Moses call story, maybe God can reveal something to you about your own sense of purpose and call through telling of a story. I've struggled all night long and all morning of where to start and what to emphasize, because I really do have a long story. And most of us want to go to lunch after church, right? So I decided I'll start from before I was even born. Okay? All right. So, and I'll skip many years in between. How about that? Is that a deal? But it's an important part, especially since we've lifted up Moses. Not to compare myself, and that's not, and all jokes aside, I'm not trying to compare myself to Moses, up until the point that we all should compare ourselves to Moses in terms of Moses being an ordinary, flawed person that God is going to use. And so with that, if there's a similarity there, that's where it ends. However, I will start that my mom was pregnant with me. Has anybody heard this story before? All right. Sound familiar to you? Happens to us all. There we go. That's what I was getting at. Thanks, Tim. My mom was pregnant with me back in, I guess, 1972. And we had a family dog. And the dog, living where we are in the country, the farmland all around, the dog comes home one evening all bloodied up and foaming and all that kind of stuff, and obviously had been attacked by a raccoon or a fox or something. And to comfort the dog, my mom allowed him to chew on the inside of her hand, and started to chew, to tease on her hand, and not thinking anything about it. They comfort the dog. Eventually, they have to take the dog to the vet, and the vet says, you've got to have this. The dog has rabies. You've got to put it down. And so, not thinking anything about it, other than the sadness of putting your dog down. And so they go home, and then eventually, over time, my mom looks down at her hand, and she has these terrible cuts on her hand, and where she has to go to the doctor. That's how bad and deep the wounds were. So they go to the doctor, and the doctor is dealing with the cuts and asks her, well, how did you get this? And the mom says, well, our dog was rabid, and I was trying to comfort it before we took it to the vet. And the doctor stopped her and said, your dog had what? And she said, well, we don't have the test results back, but the vet said it had rabies, and they put it down. And he said, oh, Mrs. Rudolph, they went through all the terrible thing of her potentially having rabies herself. And back then, the only treatment and the only way to take care of my mom was the abdomen shots. And he said, well, I'm going to get you set up. You got to get these shots, the series of shots, starting whenever. And my mom says, but I'm pregnant. And he says, okay, but you still have to have these shots. And she says, well, what would that do to my child? He said, you're going to lose this pregnancy. And you're going to have to abort this pregnancy, basically. Because you have to have the shots or you could die. And so she says, I can't do that. And so the doctor pleads with my mom and says, Ms. Rudolph, you don't understand. You have to have these shots. The doctor talks to my dad and says, Mr. Rudolph, please go home for a couple of days and talk to your wife and then get her back in here for these shots. Your wife is young and she can have more kids. I'm not sure how young my mom was, but that's the way she tells the story, that she was young. But anyway, so they go home and there's really no discussion according to the way my parents tell this story. There's just prayer. And it was through this prayer and this discernment that my dad would say that God revealed to him that mom was going to be okay and that they weren't going to abort the pregnancy, that they were going to have this kid that they were so excited about, and they were going to move on. So they go back to the doctor and they tell the doctor, no, she's not going to have the shots. She doesn't want to end the pregnancy. And the doctor basically was furious and just pleading again and again and again. But my mom refused to give up on me because of her faith in God. Amen. Amen. And so I wish that she could be here to tell the story because she would get all the details better. But you can imagine me being told that story all my life in various ways, forms, and times. A lot of times I was told that story, not just when the controversial topic of abortion came up, but that's a very powerful story. But most of the time it came up when I was disappointing my mom. And that's just not fair, right? That's just not fair. When I was being mean to my mom. Don't you know what I did for you? Yes, Mom, I've heard it 1,000 times. But on the other hand, it's a very powerful story to help shape and form you over the years. And also as you look back in the times that I did disappoint my mom and all my reckless behavior. And putting that up against my mom always telling me you have been saved for a purpose. That God allowed you and I both to live for a purpose. That really makes you feel terrible when you're doing something stupid. Maybe not when you're doing something stupid, but the next day. You look back and say, man, that was really stupid and reckless. And then you remember the story and you feel really guilty and like God's going to hate you and punish you and all that kind of stuff. But it's a story that I've obviously held on to all my life. And all along the way, at times growing up, my mom would say, she would also tell me a story about me, just like our children we have here in the church, chattering during the message. She said, one of our pastors, Glenn Stevens, with his name, said, well, Johnny, don't ever call me Johnny. He said, Johnny's going to be a pastor one day. And so we laughed and joked about that for many years. But anyway, growing up in the home that I grew up in, and faith was always very important. Athletics and faith and family, and most time in that order. That was the order of importance, but faith was very important to us. And then again, hearing these stories and seeing my mom and dad model faith all along, is just always very important to me. And then in the back of my mind, hearing this story about, you're going to be a preacher one day, and joking and laughing about that most of the time. Well, there was a point in college where, see, I'm fast forwarding, so you don't have to listen to all the years in between. There was a point in time in college where I wasn't particularly active in my faith. I mean, I've never lost my faith, but I wasn't particularly active in terms of reading scriptures and prayer and participating in a church. I would dabble here and there, and I would go to church on Sunday mornings when I wasn't out till 4 in the morning on Saturday night, those sorts of things. And so, but sometime during college, I actually sent off for information to a seminary in Ohio. And I remember that like it was yesterday, but I cannot remember for the life of me why I did that. Like I wasn't like just sitting around saying, hey, I've got to find out more information how I can live out my call. But I sent out and filled out this card, and they sent me these brochures and these magazines and letters. And I looked at the brochures, and the first picture I saw was this pastor that was standing behind the communion table, and he was all dressed up in his robe and his pyramids and his stole, and it looked like he was singing. And I was like, that is totally not me. I could never do that. So I discarded all that stuff and went on about my business of trying to figure out what I was going to do. And eventually, I was going to become a teacher and a coach. And I was so excited about that. And I kind of switched gears at the end, so I had to actually go back to college to pick up some education courses and that sort of thing. And I went, I just wanted to coach basketball. That's all I wanted to do, and the teaching was the way to do that, really, to be honest. And so I went, and there was a school system that was hiring a typing teacher after the school year had already started. And I was substituting in another system. And I found out about this typing job. And I went and I applied at this school system and sat down with the principal, and he never asked if I could type. Never asked. If he would have asked, I would have told him the truth. I swear to you, in this sanctuary, I would have told him I can't type. But he never asked. He sent me to the department head. Department head never asked, can you type? Can you type? I signed on the dotted line knowing darn well I couldn't type. And here I was going to teach these high school kids how to type. And so I went to the library and I got these books on typing. And I was one of the best typing teachers those kids ever had. In fact, the first time I was ever reviewed, and I never typed in front of the principal or the department head. If they came in, I was at the computer, I jumped up faster than a kid eating chocolate on a Sunday morning. And they weren't supposed to. Never asked. But my first review, my assistant principal at the time typed in his review, "This is the best typing class I've ever been a part of." I couldn't type. The kids didn't know it, the teachers didn't know it. And I coached basketball and loved it. I'm telling you these kind of things that really didn't have anything to do with my call, but I guess it's all it does. But it all works together. And I coached back, I took over this girls basketball team, varsity team, that hadn't won a game in 3 years. And I had never watched a girls basketball game. Ever. I had dated girl basketball players. When I was in high school and college, 3 of them to be exact. If I had my high school yearbook, I could show you her, and her. But never went to a game. And of course, boys basketball and men's basketball, yes. So I took over this team, and again, the first game of that season, we got beat 55-12. 55-12. I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun. This is never going to happen again. Never going to be 55-12 again. So the next game, it was 72-8. So I had to rephrase what I was saying. I got more specific. I said, we will never. And I told the team, I said, even if I have to check myself in the game, I said, we will never get beat this bad again. And so I'll tell you this because of what I did next. What I did next over the next 3 or 4 years is I became obsessed, not with winning. I became obsessed with not losing 72-8. And I would be involved in basketball in my mind or out wherever I was going to learn from 6:30 in the morning to midnight every day. And I became obsessed. And you know what? We never got beat that bad again. And in fact, we turned it around, and they haven't had a losing season since. Even 10 years now that I've been gone. They won a couple state championships, not while I was there. My last year coaching, we advanced to the regional tournament for the first time in 20 years, and they haven't looked back since. I became obsessed with not losing, basically. But what happened during that time, those 5 or 6 years, I was losing at home. I was losing at home. I was a terrible husband and a terrible father to Annika and Asher for his first year because I was never present. Even when I was home, I wasn't present. I was obsessed with not losing and involved in all those types of things. And so it wore me. I wasn't happy. I was not happy at all. But I wasn't thinking about quitting. I just knew I wasn't happy, especially looking back. And so over time, as that, I also at the same time got my certification to finally be a teacher. Still not in typing, but I would say yes to everything in the school system. Say yes to everything in the school system. And so once I was on an interview. We were interviewing for the assistant principal. And the superintendent there said, why didn't you apply for this job? I was like, I just became a certified teacher last year. And she said, that doesn't matter. And I said, I don't have a master's degree in leadership. She says, you can start that tomorrow. She said, UVA is starting a new program. I said, I can't get into UVA. My grades in college were not good enough to get into the best administrative program in the country. She said, I'll take care of that. And so she got me in with my 4 grades into the University of Virginia. And I started working on my leadership degree and became the associate principal a year later. And so all within 5 or 6 years of becoming a teacher of typing and couldn't be able to type, so I was the associate principal of the school. And so things were really going in a fast way to the top of education, basically. All the while trying trying to figure out life as a father and a husband and a basketball coach. And so one night I came home, and you've heard this story in various ways. But one night I came home through all this at, 4:30 in the morning. And Annika and baby Asher at the house, and Melissa waiting for me in the kitchen. All right? I told you this, Ron, you got to stand up. Can you stand up? Just for new people, just in case. But she grabbed me by the shirt like this, Pastor Melissa, and said, basically, you're a jerk. She didn't say it that nice, Ron. You're a jerk, but I still love you. And go sleep on the couch. I had to clean that up for the sanctuary. And then, by the way, you're going to be at church tomorrow, in 4 hours. And so I went to church that day, and that's a turning point in my life. It's a turning point. Because I hadn't been doing my best at home. And in fact, I was extremely disrespectful to Melissa and Annika and Asher. And so at that point in time, I had a repentance right on the spot, burning bush moment. I said, I'm not going to do this. This is not who I am. It's not why I was raised in this family of faith at home and had an awesome model as a dad and had that burning bush moment as my mom refusing to abort me. And I had this wonderful wife that my mom had prayed for all her life. My mom used to get so scared I was never going to get married. And she would always say, because my brothers got married young. And I was getting past their ages, and my mom just freaked out that I wasn't going to get married. And she said, you're never going to find a wife in a bar. I said, I know, but you can have a whole lot of fun looking for one. So anyway, she prayed for Melissa all that. Now, I've told you that story before, so I won't get into that. But I was getting ready to blow it. And so just right on the spot, after she yanked me up, and I got up and went to church, and I repented and never looked back and asked for forgiveness to her and to God and said, this is not who I want to be. I want to be a good husband, a good dad. I want to be good at my career at the same time. But I want to be a supportive husband as well. So I got really back into scripture and prayer and active in church and started to lead things at the church and get on committees and teams and Bible study leading. And it was just a complete turnaround because Melissa had the courage to yank me up. And it helped. It was just shook me and made me realize that, hey, this is no way to thank God for the life that He's given me. And so I started to live life that way. And so then to fast forward, it was that whole next year where I learned to balance my life a lot better. And so I was having just as much success and fun at work, but at the same time being who I needed to be at home and in my faith as well. And as I started to help Melissa through the church, I think I started to get some clarity and some, it's all right, this is really, really a good thing. And then I started to pursue lay speaking. And so I got some training and some equipping to be a lay speaker. I started speaking, and then I'll fast forward again to one night, I was going to speak at the church that we were getting married, that we got married in. And it was that night, that morning, early in the morning, where Melissa woke me up. So she shook me, about 6:30 in the morning and said, you got to get up. I said, not yet. It's only 6:30. She said, no, you got to get up. You have to go pray. I said, what are you talking about? And she says, I had a dream that God is going to use you as a prophet. I said, I know. I said, I'm going to preach in a couple hours. I'm going to go back to sleep now. She said, no, I don't mean today. I mean, God's calling you to be a preacher. And that freaked me out. It scared me. I was like, but you're already a preacher. How can we have two preachers in the same house? She said, don't worry about that right now. Just get up and go pray. So I went and prayed at the church. They had a little chapel. I went and prayed early in the morning. And then I went and I delivered 2 or 3 sermons that morning. And then as one of the most impactful things that day, other than Melissa shaking me, and I know I've mentioned this before, but when the congregation was leaving, the 11 o'clock service, the pastor's wife who was there. The pastor was sick. Mrs. Kroll, who actually owns property here in Hampstead, doesn't live here now. They're going to build a house someday. But Mrs. Kroll, as she's walking out, she says, "You've missed your calling." I said, "Mrs. Kroll, you have no idea what you're saying and what I've been through already today." And so that was an immediate affirmation that my life was going to something. And so then from then on, from that day on, we had to I had to discern and figure out what exactly does that mean and how we're going to go about it. Melissa's already a pastor. It's going to complicate things terribly. I've had all this success in the school system. I'm working my way through that. I like it, and it's going well. So how in the world, why would God be calling me out of that? Why would God be calling me out of that and into something else? And so I figured, as we figured, and we prayed, and then we also said, how in the world are we going to afford it? It's going to be, we finally making some money, and now we're going to give all that up to go back to school. That's just crazy. And so we just prayerfully discerned and figured out that this calling is real, and that everything that I've been doing in the school system was actually equipping me and training me and preparing me for this other calling. And so it wasn't throwing things away, as my best friend in the school system said. How in the world could you throw all this away? My best friend. It wasn't throwing it away. It was all part of the process of equipping me and preparing me for working with you today. And so once we got to that point, I said, okay, we can make this happen. And we put everything else, I'll tell you those stories another day. I put everything else as trust and faith in God, and He was going to work it out. I did have one barrier left. I had this image, again, going back to that brochure, I had this image of what a pastor was supposed to be. From growing up and seeing how sophisticated and educated and put together the pastors were. And I had this wonderful model, all jokes aside, of Pastor Melissa and how eloquent she was, and how in order she was, and how faithful she was, and how she gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning and prays in the closet. I said, I can't do any of that. That's not who I am. And so how in the world is God going to equip me that much to change from who I am to be the people that I saw in front of the church all my life? I can't do that. And God revealed to me over time that He didn't want me to change any of that. That I had to be who I am. God was calling me for who I am. And if the higher-ups didn't like that, then that was their problem, not my problem. And I was going to be exactly who I am. And I was going to learn, and I was going to grow through all this, and I still am learning, and still growing, and still making mistakes. But I wasn't going to be changed at the core of who I am. And I got very peaceful about that. And I said, okay, God, if I can be who I am, then I'm all in. I'm all in. And that's really how I've tried to operate and navigate this system of ordination and calling and living out my call. And so it's been a wonderful thing, because now what I do know is that I have never been happy. I'm like the happiest guy there ever has been. At home, at church, in the car, at the hospital beds, not when you're sick, but holding babies. I've never been happier than I ever am right now, right here. And so the joy that came from teaching and basketball coaching was just a fraction of the complete joy that I have now. And I know the reason and the source of that is that I have lived into God's will for my life. I am working. I hate that word even, working. It does not work. I'm just living out this call. My career and my call have matched up. And that's what it's all about. And when you can live out what God's equipped and called you to do, then that's where you get a sense of joy and happiness that you can experience no other place. And you're going to have pastors in the past, pastors in the future, that are going to be pastors for other reasons. quite frankly. And you're going to be able to tell right away. Because they're not going to love you. Or they're only going to love you when it's going great. I'm going to love Earl even when he doesn't love me back. Because that's who I am. And I don't say that to brag. But I might not be able to talk as sophisticated as some preachers. I might not be able to memorize as many Bible verses. But I promise you this. I'll love you with all my heart, mind, and soul. As I love myself. And I can do that without doing any work at all. Because it comes naturally. Because God has given me that gift. And so I love you. The best that I can possibly love you. I'm learning to talk and read and do all those kinds of things. But I already know how to love you. And I can't type still. I can't spell. But I'm happy. I'm happy even when things are challenging. Because there are things that are challenging. There's things that are hard. But I'm happy. I'm living out the true purpose and calling for my life that God's given to me. So thankful to be able to say that. It's the same for your careers. It's the same for the work that you do in the church. You're never going to be truly happy until your career, whatever career that is, and God's purpose and call for your life match up. And for all of us in here, it's going to be different. And some of you are going to be called to own your own small business. Some of you are going to be called to be managers of retail. Some of you are going to be called to tech jobs. Some of you are called to farming or trucking or whatever it is. And it doesn't matter how much money you make. You're never, or how little money you make, or how many hours you work, or how little hours you work. You're never going to be truly happy until that career and God's purpose for your life match up. And so that's how you know if you're being called to be a banker, or called to be a teacher, or called to be manager of McDonald's, or called to be working for the city government, or called to be a firefighter or a police officer. Firefighters and police officers, I guarantee you, Scott knows a half dozen women and men who truly are not called to be police officers. And those are the guys and gals that are miserable at work and at home and have drinking problems and otherwise because of it, or abuse people, public, and so forth and so on. Firefighters the same way. Plenty of people in the department that are just firefighters because their dad was. And it comes out and it shows. You have to be called to be happy. You have to be called to be equipped to do your job at the best. You have to be called to be a police officer like Scott in order to put your life on the line every day. You have to be called like Kevin and Earl and others in here that are firefighters to go into a burning building and save people you don't even know. You have to be called to do that. Or you're going to be miserable and hateful and terrible at your job. For church work is the same way. You have to be called to be a youth director. You have to be called to be the music director. You have to be called to put the bulletins together, Gwen. You have to be called to be ushers. You have to be called to do whatever it is you're doing, to be a trustee. You have to be called to vacuum the carpet. If you're not, you're going to be miserable and hateful. There's nothing worse than a miserable, hateful Christian. It's counterproductive for everything we're trying to do. If you're miserable at whatever you're doing for our church, stop doing it. Stop doing it. You're not a miserable person. You're doing a job you're not called to do. If you don't love coming in here and handing out bulletins, stop doing it. We won't be mad at you. We'll be thankful because we'll get somebody there that's called to do it that'll smile and be friendly to the people coming in the door. Counterproductive. We're all called to do something. Man, when you hear and it's revealed to you, no matter what your age is, that's the wonderful thing about the Bible is because God calls the very young and God calls the very, very, very old, even older than Earl, to do things. And it's never too late to hear your call. And when you do, and you say yes, and God equips you to do it, that's where you find true peace and happiness and joy. So I thank you for your patience this morning as I went all around about ways to tell you a little bit about who I was, who I am, and who I want to be. As I live out the call God's put on my life. I'm so thankful I get to do it with you. Amen? Amen. We're going to call our firefighters up front and our police officers. And then, so come on down. And then if you have a parent or a spouse that's not here and you want to come stand for them, that'd be good too. And we have Earl in the back here. So first of all, we'll stand and look at the congregation. Christy, come on down for your parent. Here's the microphone. We have the hand mic. You just have to talk loud. Where's Jonathan? You gotta wake him up. Here you go. To be a hero, as we like to think of firefighters and police officers, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's a calling. And so we just want to take a brief moment to just say thank you for your service, and also to honor you and say a prayer for you and bless you, and just to remind you that as you go on your way, our prayers go with you. But I would like to put you on the spot and at least just say who you are or who you're representing and what you do. You can say whatever you can make it as simple or complex as you would like.
Well, Mom and Dad are away for the weekend, but as many of you know, my dad was a Baltimore City police officer at the K-9 for 21 years, I believe, and he retired in 96, I think. And now he's continuing a little bit of that as bailiff at the courthouse in Westminster.
My name is Scott Fisher. I'm a 17-year former county police detective. I'm in a unit now where we go and apprehend the other units' bad guys. We can find murderers, rapists, robbers. We go and get their bad guys. So it gets a little exciting sometimes. It gets a little scary sometimes. But it's a lot of fun. I don't have a burning bush moment, but it's without a doubt my calling. I love my job. I love going to work, so it's great.
My name's Kevin Han. I'm a 27-year veteran of the Hampstead Fire Department. I've been a volunteer. I was inspired by a lot of the great people that have gone before me. One of them is sitting in the back, Mr. Earl. How many years, Earl? 60. 60 years. He's been a volunteer and still out there doing different aspects of the job every day. And it is a calling. And you feel blessed to be able to do it to help your fellow community members.
I'm Ralph Orchard. I'm a retired Baltimore City police officer for 22 years.
All right.
I'm Stacy Han. I grew up my entire life in the fire department. My mom, my dad, my brother, all volunteer. My sister as well volunteered. We volunteer fire call. My father just retired from Baltimore County Fire Department, and thankfully, because of the fire department, I got a wonderful husband. And I have many good friends. They're police officers, and unfortunately, several years ago, lost a best friend in the line of duty.
My godfather, he was in the SWAT, and he passed away.
Well, we will give you a gift of a Bible and a bookmark. The bookmark has a special prayer that we'll say here in just a moment. The Bible is good for your glove compartment or under your seat.